Hello, and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab lecture series. It is my great pleasure to introduce you today to Ben Joseph Andrews and Emma Roberts, an artist duo exploring new media and in particular multimodal installations and performance in really interesting and meaningful ways. We often ask why VR, and I think their work tells us why. I first came across their work with a project they created called Gondwana, a durational VR experience set in the Daintree rainforest in far north Queensland, Australia, where you can roam through it. Over a 24-hour period, the rainforest degrades as they artistically render climate data projections up to the year 2090. Today, they're going to talk about their project Turbulence, which explores Ben's own experience with vestibular migraines. In their own words, their work seeks to create novel states of embodiment that momentarily expands perceptions, reawakens curiosity, and instills a sense of awe and wonder in the world that surrounds and permeates us. I would definitely agree that their work does this. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on Ben and Emma. Ben and Emma, if you want to turn on your cameras. Great. Welcome, Ben and Emma. I will let you take it from here. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the MIT Open Doc team for having us here. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this project, along with all of our projects, was created on the lands of the Wathaurong people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. This land was unceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. To begin, I'd like to, firstly, maybe I'll just quickly share my screen. To begin, I'd like to invite you all to close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Take a moment to consider the stillness of your body, the ground beneath your feet. Does it all feel stable and solid and real? You can open your eyes now. My name's Ben Joseph Andrews, and this is Emma Roberts, and we're an Australian artist duo working with new media.
Lately, we've been thinking a lot about how VR as a technology can be critically examined through a disabled lens. And this is what we wanted to focus on today, as Sarah mentioned. But because it's always a little hard to communicate experiential work just through a screen and through words, what we thought we'd do is try a kind of hybrid talk/live performance with VR, along with all the technical danger that comes with that. So I'm going to be on another screen for most of the talk, and we'll come back together at the end for questions. The other complication is that we're currently at CPH Doc, so we're doing this from our hotel room. So what could go wrong? Let's see how we go.
So this interest has sprung from a neurological chronic condition that I have called vestibular migraine, or VM. For those of you who don't know, the vestibular system is located in the inner ear, and it's responsible for our sense of movement, orientation, balance, and equilibrium. Where classic migraine is typically pain dominant and episodic, vestibular migraine is different. It's 24/7, and it expresses itself not only through pain, but through vertigo, dizziness, and the chronic misperception of motion. I often describe vestibular migraine as a form of motion synesthesia, where my body interprets external and internal signals of motion as my own self-movement. And this creates a lot of conflict, as my body thinks that it's moving in ways that I'm not. False movements, phantom movements, movements that are amplified and reconfigured. The word vestibular is derived from Latin vestibule, meaning antechamber, referring to its position as an entrance into the hardest part of the human body, the skull. Today, the vestibular system is an opening through which we will explore the underlying mechanics of embodied technologies such as VR, as well as their potential to be reclaimed as a vehicle for exploring disabled embodiment and non-normative perception, ideas which have formed the basis for an ongoing mixed reality docu-essay series we're creating called Turbulence. I will say that Turbulence is co-created with Emma, as well as through deep collaboration and conversation with Matt Faisandia, Erin K. Taylor, and Jamie Pereira. But first, a little background to us. Emma and I have been working together in XR since about 2016. And one thing that immediately fascinated us about this technology was that the headset inherently has a dual role. It is a screen, yes, but it is also a blindfold. By completely shuttering the eyes, its presence creates absence. This is something that isn't often acknowledged by the industry, and in fact is often critically and creatively ignored. Perhaps we should say that embodiment in VR is dual, paradoxical, present somewhere that you're not, and absent somewhere that you are. And this absence isn't an inconsequential or lesser part of immersion, but a fundamental pillar of the immersive condition of VR. And we've always really been fascinated by this liminal state, what lies latent there, and how it can be brought into an experience. We believe that some of the most interesting frameworks for presence in VR incorporate, in its true sense of the word, as a bringing into the body, the shadow of absence that necessarily lingers and permeates beyond the screen. Our early work within VR and XR centered around curating multisensory experience that was capable of engaging the axes of presence and absence. We're really drawn to the possibility of harnessing the unknowable, that which lies outside the headset, as a means of opening up the conditions for a dehabituated experience, or what pioneering VR artist Shah Davies calls a seeing freshly. What you're seeing now is one of those pieces, Starless, which was a live scored, multi-room, multi-sensory near-death experience that explored the archetypal walk towards the light. I'll show you a quick video of that now. What we were interested in exploring with Starless was opening this space between presence and absence as a framework for composing an experience that borders on the vast, the powerful, the unknown, but in a way that was really grounded in something radiant, beautiful, ecstatic. And with this work, we really lent into the non-visual or anti-visual affordances of the headset by playing a lot with sensory mismatch and incongruity, where what is seen doesn't conform necessarily to what is felt underneath the feet, by what aromas are smelt in the space beyond the headset, by the spatiality that can be touched or sensed in the real world but is inconsistent with what's seen on the screen in front of you. Through this, the audience has to create their own meaning, their own associations or affects to understand or make sense of this liminal feeling. In hindsight, it's easy to look back and see an obsession with sensory mismatch in a lot of our early work that mirrors the sensory mismatch that I was experiencing with vestibular migraine. Olfactory hallucinations, the hallucinations of smell that aren't really there, the sensation of being misproportioned, like Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Even this persistent sense that the world lacks solidity or density. These weren't things that I was necessarily drawing upon consciously, but I can now see very clearly how they manifested unconsciously through so much of my creative and artistic focus on liminality. Interestingly, VM can be exacerbated by visual dependence, where my body becomes too reliant on the visual information it receives. And I now realize that I was feeding a lot of this latently into our work, an unconscious exploration of what can take place beyond the visual, when our senses are called upon for meaning making, and when these unsignified sensations flood in to fill the gaps of vision. Of course, the liminality we're exploring through work such as Starless very much emphasized the positive potential of being brought into a liminal space, but the liminality I was experiencing through my condition was increasingly debilitating. Something I saw as a barrier to my creative practice, as something I had to persevere through, rather than something that was creative in and of itself, let alone perhaps the latent source of my creative interest in the first place. But as anyone in the audience might know who has the experience of trying to push their disability off to a side, rather than embracing and working with it, this mindset became increasingly unsustainable for me. So as we continue to make VR after Starless, we spent the next 4 years, in fact, making an immense project called Gondwana that Sarah alluded to in the beginning. Alongside Gondwana, my VM was getting worse and worse. The VR headset can in fact be one of my biggest triggers. And this production really spiraled into a dark night of the soul, where spending even 30 seconds in VR could derail days, sometimes weeks at a time. My body was so susceptible to motion that the illusory movement of VR, those attempts to render virtual movement through real movement, but never quite getting it right, sent a cascade of signals that were false and untrue into a system that could no longer determine what was mine and what was not. A feedback loop that never quite stabilized. So this device became one that I feared. Its side effects were so intense and unpredictable that I was viscerally afraid of using the headset. but I also felt an obligation to continue the production of Gondwana and finish the work. During this, I made a not so silent pact, a pact that something went along the lines of fuck VR, and I resolved to never work with the technology again after finishing Gondwana. So incompatible was the headset with my vestibular system. So I very actively moved away from VR and instead became interested in VM itself. I figured if it's something I couldn't hide from anymore, perhaps it was something I could artistically explore, which at the time honestly felt like quite a radical concept. So we spent the next 6 months in very active research and development, focusing on integrating VM into my life. Not only through a range of lifestyle changes, but also into my artistic practice, which I reframed to explore and develop an emergent aesthetics of motion misperception across interactive and digital media more broadly. You see, vestibular migraine unsettles so many fundamental ways in which I perceive the world. Subject and object relations dissolve and become porous. But these are so difficult to convey through words. Like describing smell, motion is amorphous and slippery. And very soon we started to press against the borders of language and vocabulary for communicating motion misperception. So, for example, we might typically hear a conversation more or less like this, where my body is the big circle and the speaker is the small circle.
And when you use the word movement, so if you can, I mean, if you can see the table, you might need to dip and this is not mapping out your story, okay, this is just me mapping out your kind of thesis, as it were. When you're talking about movement, and here we have someone who is moving, and then here is the world around them, okay, if you can see it, and the world around them occasionally moves because, like, for example, trees moving. Are you incorporating, when you use the word movement there, are you also incorporating the perception of other stuff that somehow impacts on our movement? Because I was just thinking about how broad, you know, how sort of, I'm trying to understand these sort of circles, as it were, you know, as to how limited these circles are in terms of what you mean by the word movement. And it seems like you're sort of suggesting that movement also incorporates, for want of a better word, the perception of other things that impact on our movements. And I didn't know if that's what you really meant.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely part of it. So we began to consider how else we might be able to reframe this expression through an interactive lens, moving beyond description, linguistic description, to convey how certain metaphors like these circles of impossible movement you just heard might sound and feel. Because for me, this voice is not a static source of sound like most people might experience it. It's not simply in front of me, but it's moving around me, within me, dynamically. And this voice is not a singular object, but something more multiple, fragmented, that has layers of sound that move somehow independently within me. And the movement speeds of each of these layers are not fixed and consistent, but somehow variable and unpredictable. So perhaps the sound of the voice is more like this.
And when you use the word movement, so if you can have and this is not mapping out your story, okay, this is just mapping out your kind of thesis, as it were. When you're talking about movement, and here we have someone who is moving, and then here is the world around them, okay, you see it, and the world around them Are you incorporating, when you use the word are you also incorporating the perception of other stuff that somehow impacts on our lives? Because I'm just thinking about how broad, you know, how I'm trying to understand sort of circles as to how limited these circles are in terms of what do you mean by the word movement? It seems like your source suggesting that movement also incorporates one of the words, the perception of other things that impact on our movement. I didn't know what one of them you were intended to. Is that what you mean by other things?
Okay, let me just turn all of these different voices down a little bit. So what this research, this R&D allowed us to do was spend time exploring a kind of a plethora of new media. From a piece called This Is How I See Your Fucking Carpet that kind of explores how difficult it is to look at Moire videos as a commentary on the inaccessible carpet choices in specialist waiting rooms, to experiments with sound responsive installations like this that translate small sounds into something much larger, something much vaster.
Kinetic expansion.
That's Matt, the creator of a lot of the music that you hear today. So you've got now a face to the sounds. As well as this project, House Unmoored, which was a projection onto cloth, which walked and moved based on data from my migraine journal. So this kind of R&D process was really the first time that we built things from scratch ourselves rather than working with a development team to do so. It felt particularly important for this process that I was developing and experimenting myself, especially as it became clear early on that a core part of this work was building a new vocabulary, a new language through this kind of auto-phenomenological exploration. But one thing that was also interesting about the R&D process was that after a while, I also found myself interested in VR again, in addition to these new forms, strangely. And this was because I often found myself describing sensations of vestibular migraine through glitches that often happen in virtual reality. Like when the tracking goes wrong and your body drifts off from yourself in weird ways. I was fascinated with how phenomena of misembodiment in VR were these potent touchstones for my own experience. And this made me realize that perhaps there's an underlying grammar of misperception authored by the technology's instability. The headset, while fraught, is an eerie window into thinking about VM as a state of embodiment in flux, an elastic embodiment. The headset is, in some key ways, a proxy brain that, through its plasticity of wires and data, can reveal to us not only the ways we perceive our perceptions, but how these perceptions can be made to stretch and expand. Why this is particularly interesting for vestibular migraine is that while we often think of VR in terms of its visual, oral, or interactive affordances, less often do we consider how the headset is, at its very center, a fundamentally vestibular device. It relies on the constant detection and processing of movement in order to accurately determine our position and orientation within space. And this was the birth of Turbulence as a project, exploring how embodied technologies like VR, by premise of creating illusory embodiment, offers an opportunity to look into how our sense of self is mediated and sustained in our own bodies. Along the way, we were really inspired by other deaf-disabled artists who deconstruct their own medium to challenge and explore different modes of accessibility and normativity, such as Christine Sun Kim and Jerome Alice. VR's inaccessibility, its hostility, its deeply provocative nature became something that I could creatively engage with and address head on to understand how we understand movement. And the VR headset understands movement by breaking it down into 6 parts, the 6 degrees of freedom. So Emma, it's now time to put the headset on. You feeling good? So these different 6 axes are yaw, like opening the door. Pitch, like nodding yes. Roll, tilting the ear to the shoulder. Heave, up. Oh, wait 1 second. Stay there. Try again. A little bit better. It's not your performance, I promise. There's surge, which is forward and back movement. And finally, sway, left to right movement. While these seem simple enough in isolation, in reality, they all work together, forming a complex system of interconnected movement and counter movement. If Emma walks around, we see how no movement occurs in isolation. Even if a movement might appear to engage only one axis, actually, all axes are engaged. What you mightn't know is how closely the 6 degrees of freedom mirror the vestibular labyrinth of our inner ear. Like this model that you're seeing now, our bodies have 3 semicircular canals detecting rotation, pitch, and yaw, while the neighboring otolithic organs, the utricle and the saccule, work in concert to relay signals of linear acceleration through space, heave, surge, and sway. So really what we're looking at here is the headset making visible the data that our own body inputs and outputs, how it constructs a fluid, seamless sense of space, technological and biological anatomies of movement intertwined. But my vestibular system isn't seamless. While my inner ear functions correctly, the signals of movement that it sends are misprocessed. Like a bug in the system, the migraine mistranslates accurate movement data into something else, something aberrant, something other. Like I said, I often describe VM as a synesthetic mode of perception, a motion synesthesia where everything that I smell, touch, hear, look at are all translated into movement signals that my body takes on as its own. Through this, I shapeshift. The boundaries of my senses can stretch into the distance and incorporate the rhythms of other forces, both human and more than human. I can become the movement of a crowd on a busy intersection. Or the rise and fall of my breath. And at times it feels like my sensation of movement is no longer fluid or continuous, but stuttering, stretching, pulling apart. And the movements that my body is registering is not immediately cleared from this cache of memory, but continues to linger within me, as if I can still feel myself moving like I was seconds ago, minutes ago, hours ago. Residual movements, all overlapping one another. And through this state of motion confusion, my entire vestibular system becomes overwhelmed, oversaturated, oversensitized. The porosity of my vestibular system and the malleability of movement data from the headset glitching into something new, something different. Technological and biological anatomies as they expand and fall apart together. You can take a little break now, Emma. So we often think of VR as a seamless technology, striving to create a seamless immersion. But I became very interested in these themes, particularly because in a lot of ways, a disabled experience is seamed. So we started to explore how immersive embodied technologies can be hijacked and repurposed to express non-normative perceptions and experiences of misembodiment. The first project that emerged out of this creative research was Jamais Vu, a mixed reality piece delving into the phenomenon of derealization and depersonalization that premiered at IDFA last year and is currently showing at CPH Docs here in Copenhagen. Jamais vu is an inversion of that sensation of déjà vu, where the latter gives this feeling that something's happened before. Jamais vu refers to the unsettling feeling that the familiar has suddenly become unfamiliar. You may have encountered this sensation yourself through the repetition of language. Perhaps when you're writing or saying aloud the same word over and over again until it becomes so strange that you're convinced it's no longer a word at all. This loosening of signification often occurs to me, not for a few moments, but hours, sometimes days at a time. And of course, it doesn't just affect language, but something more foundational, the reality of reality. In this piece, we use this framework to tell a story seated at my desk, guiding you into contact with yourself, performing yourself, confronting your own mediation with the world as something constructed, tenuous, requiring renegotiation. Okay, Emma, you can put the headset on and kneel by this not at all makeshift desk. I'm going to turn this lamp on for you. You got it. So this piece begins over black, asking you to consider the weight and density of your body and the chair beneath you. And then
look down at your hands, and as you do, slowly open your eyes. You can wriggle your fingers a little, or move your hands about. The onset of jamais vu always catches me like this. Like you, I find myself looking at my hands. I know that they're mine, but I'm struck by how different they appear. My body suddenly feels new, foreign, like some kind of avatar. I should say, this isn't actually what I see, but it's as close to the feeling as I've been able to get of something veiled, uncanny. And here I am, staring at my hands, sitting at a desk filled with objects I no longer recognize as my own.
here you're then encouraged to explore the things around you. So go on, Emma, reach out and explore what's on this table in front of you. What interested us about bringing this sensation into mixed reality was the particular feeling offered by what's called pass-through, a digitally rendered first-person perspective, often from the cameras inbuilt into the headset, but here, a camera that's installed at the front of the headset. Here, you are not a 3D modeled avatar, but what you're seeing is yourself, your physical environment, yet these are made uncanny, separate, like being in two places at once, yet somehow in neither at all. You see, I know that a really bad migraine flare is about to happen when I look into the mirror and don't recognize myself as myself. But the sensation of jamais vu infects more than just my own reflection. It's the loss of familiarity with my own body, the way that it moves, the way that I operate it. And this loss of embodied coordinates is rendered here within the experience through an inversion of vision. What you see in the headset is flipped on the x-axis. Your left hand appears as your right hand appears as your left. Your world is literally and figuratively overturned, but even when everything becomes weird like this and unfamiliar,
Even though the world feels different,
the everyday goes on.
the everyday goes on. Even simple things become strangely difficult. I want you to reach out and grab the mug in front of you and place it on the coaster. And then find the aspirin in the Tupperware next to the books. It's okay. Take your time. I know how hard it is trying to process all this. Things that used to be so easy. You're looking for one of those twist top containers. 3 pills into the mug. Make sure they're the white ones. And water. You need to add water too. My drink bottle. I know it's here somewhere. Where is it? Everything's moving. Everything's changing and it's getting harder and harder. And the more I try to push through it, the more reality stretches at the seams. The more this elasticity feels like it's merging with me and like I'm bending into it, like it's dissolving me, becoming me.
Jamais vu invites us to consider the fragility of perception, but also the multiplicity of ways that we can experience the world. And ultimately posits that the loss of the familiar opens an opportunity to rediscover yourself and the world anew. One thing that struck me in the process of creating Jamais Vu was how it involved fundamentally producing or recreating an embodied state of misembodiment. So I'm now going to do something that you probably shouldn't do, and I'm going to see if we can delve into Emma's virtual brain. So I'm just going to move this pane over here, just giving you a little behind the curtains view of what's been happening back here. We're just going to zoom into this node here. I use the word brain because it's fitting in many ways. What you're seeing now is the view that I've occupied during much of the development of Jamais Vu. To make VR requires the creation of a network of interconnected perceptions, usually in a software like Unity or Unreal, but today we're using Touch Designer. And I've learned to see this neurology of wires and signal chains as a pseudo brain. Here, from this view, we can essentially see 3 different systems, one of which controls Emma's visual system, this kind of purple network at the top, the middle, which kind of controls her auditory system, and of course, down the bottom, a network which controls her movement system, her vestibular system. So we could say the leftmost part of this network relates to the input, the raw source of perceptions. And the rightmost part of this network relates to the output. Input of raw perceptions, output of experience, shall we say. But in the middle here, this kind of represents, this entangled mess of connections represents the processing of this information. Of course, Emma does not experience directly what occurs in the bulk of this network, but it nonetheless shapes the conditions for her perception. So let's just zoom in and look at one of these inputs in greater detail. So here we see the camera as it's inputted into the software. Like my inner ear, it's kind of at this stage functioning more or less correctly, capturing, let's say, an accurate-ish depiction of the world. What struck me, though, when creating Jamais Vu was how clear it became to me that VM is an experience that takes place between input and output. Migraine is, at its very core, a condition of misprocessing. It scrambles the flow of information. It distorts the signals. It amplifies their intensities and recombines one crisscrossing wire with another. So what's built here is just one snapshot of what vestibular migraine might be for me in one moment. But of course, it's ever-changing, multimodal. It could be this 1 minute, and then the signal chain could recombine in another minute. Let's say it might start to react to sound, audio, what's coming in through Emma's microphone. I should say Emma's not actually seeing this inside the headset. Vestibular migraine reacts to whatever inputs are coming in and amalgamates them in different and unstable ways. To me, what this reveals is the beautiful delicacy of our perception, that shifting such small things can change not just the difference between pain and not pain, movement and not movement, but the fundamental building blocks of how we know ourselves as ourselves and our reality as our reality. Normally, of course, all this processing is invisible. So the process of visualizing and building out my experience in this software became a really profound realization. In my pursuit of trying to express my interior experience of VM, I stepped into a new relationship with my shape-shifting neurology. I began to transform and deform realities like it. I began to think like it, to act like it. I became the migraine. Let's zoom out of Emma's brain again. So I want you to take a moment once more to consider the stillness of your body, the stability of the ground beneath your feet. And I want to show you one final thing. My experience of this type of migraine results in an incredible awareness of how much movement there is in the world, invisible to others. So Emma, if you can just grab the headset and put it on this very nicely framed floor. Maybe just back a little bit. And then just walk away from it. Leave it there. There's something about watching the flow of the raw, unmediated motion data from the headset as it sits still on the ground. The constant detection of movement smaller than the eye can see, exposing that stasis itself is dynamic, composed of unquantifiable movements. While I've wanted to turn away from this technology, I now see it as a window in and a way of exploring what vestibular migraine is for me. This data echoes my own experience that movement in all its multitudes of intensities and velocities is constant. From the blood that's flowing within our bodies, to the ground that's tilting beneath our feet, to the fact that we're hurtling through the universe this very second at incomprehensible speeds. Perhaps this condition aligns us with something more potential, something more essential, sorry. The granular, the cosmic, that even stillness, reality itself, is ever moving, ever changing, ever becoming. Thank you. Thank you to my co-creator and collaborator and performer for today, Emma Roberts, as well as to Matt Fasandia, Erin K. Taylor, and Jamie Pereira for an ongoing, very deep collaboration and conversation that have shaped so much of this project and many other projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And if you want to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm just
come back. And I'm here. That was really brilliant and fascinating. I also we have here several panelists who are going to join us. Rasheen Fahandej and Mandy Rose and Halsey Bergend and Joanna Wright. Thank you for being here. Really incredible work. I saw it at IDFA too, and I was just really taken by, how much you could use VR to really talk about your experience. It's incredible. I'm curious about the reaction to it, both maybe within the community of people who have this type of vestibular migraines, if you've played it with them, and just the general public, if they it gives you such a wonderful way to talk about it and help people understand that they never could otherwise. And I just love to hear a little bit about how it's been in the world.
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's been tremendously powerful, I think, on a personal level for me to firstly kind of go through this process a lot with Emma, who's, obviously a deep collaborator and co-creator, but also my partner. And, a lot of this project began as on a very kind of simple and intimate level of trying to express what was really inexpressible between us, and for us to kind of understand a little bit of, how our kind of experiences border one another, and creating Jamais Vu and sharing it has been, really kind of cathartic in a lot of ways, and then very brilliant in terms of the audience responses. It's quite a challenging work for sure. Like it's not an easy piece, and certainly for those with motion sensitivities or vestibular conditions, it's really heavily discouraged, really, that they use it. It's not for people who have those kind of sensitivities, but it's been the conversations that have come from it, the kind of vulnerability, I think, that is shared from me in the voiceover, but then also the vulnerability that puts you in as an audience, and the kind of intimacy of that experience where it's really unsettling, very kind of formative ways of being with and negotiating the world, and that's kind of really drawing very closely on my own experience with this kind of derealization and depersonalization. But it's been really interesting as well, the universality of it, because so many people have come out of Jamais Vu and remembered, an experience that's been very similar, often from childhood, where kind of perception is obviously a lot more malleable. And it's been quite often people have come up to me and said, I couldn't believe that reawakened this kind of dormant memory of feeling scrambled, or my body, I wasn't kind of in control of it, or I had this kind of misproportioned Alice in Wonderland syndrome-esque kind of relationship to the world around me. And I find that's been really interesting as well. How about you?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's certainly been a lot of people as well who have come through with some connection to vestibular conditions as well, or to depersonalization, derealization. Full stop. Like, I think it's been a real binding point, even if, as Ben alluded to, because it is an intensely motion-based work, we very like openly kind of flag that as an accessibility element, and that's not really a thing very often in XR, right? You know, I often have to go through things first so I can check that they're okay for Ben. Yeah, a lot of people like watching from the outside as well, if they don't feel comfortable going through, and just having these really open conversations that I think is really, like, it's been really incredible, particularly because you have been so, I guess, isolated with the condition for a long time. Like, you haven't had people that have shared that experience that you're able to connect with, and having an experience out in the world has really brought that out. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
It's incredible commitment on your part, Ben, to do this, because it's hard to do, you know, like all the dizziness. So bravo on that end too. Before I go to Halsey, I just want to say to anyone listening, to the attendees, we welcome your questions. If you have any, please put them in the Q&A, and we will ask them for you. So please put your questions or comments in the Q&A. Halsey.
Hi, Ben and Emma. It's so nice to see you guys and hear about this project. It's amazing. I'm going to try to have a question here, but it's a bit of a relaying of an experience, kind of, Ben, like you were saying. Lots of people seem like they get in and then get out and relay the experience. Obviously, I wasn't just in the experience myself, but I still was immediately brought back to a fairly recent time where I had a very significant bout of vertigo. And I don't know how vertigo relates to VM specifically. I don't really know too much about vertigo, except it was an awful experience. And I ended up, you know, getting a lot of advice, from medical advice and all of that. It's eventually went away. But the thing that I want to ask a bit from you about is this: as I was researching sort of what happened to me, there was these, you know, I'll use the analogy of software and hardware in terms of, you know, that lots of people were like, oh, there's an infection in your inner ear, and that's causing your, you know, hardware to send faulty signals to your software, your brain. You obviously referred to more of VM as being sort of a software thing, where you were getting, at least what you were saying, I think, was you're getting good signals, but the signals were being interpreted in a slightly atypical fashion, I suppose. And this is just so fascinating to me. I mean, because people sort of, you know, doctors talked about, for me, both my hardware potentially being in infection, inflammation, whatever, causing these signals to be wrong, and then my brain not knowing what to do with them. But then also there was a lot of discussion, at least, and a lot of supposition on my part, I suppose, about my brain sort of, for whatever reason, you know, I don't know, anxiety, stress induced, you know, who knows what kind of mental challenges there might be that have sort of led to this, you know, very physical, you know, traumatic experience. But obviously there's just this interplay between hardware and software. And sorry, this is not very eloquent, but I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about those two things and that interplay, which I'm sure you've thought tons more than I have about. It's super curious to me. So if that makes sense, hopefully.
Absolutely. Yeah, goodness, it sounds like a really intense, experience. So I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Yeah, like you know, it's a similar analogy, you know, that often you get checked for a lot of things in terms of the hardware, you know, like, is the inner ear, you know, does it have any sign of damage? You get the MRI to get, like, make sure that there's no, you know, kind of physical structures or things that shouldn't be there on the brain that might be kind of shifting things. And in a lot of ways, migraine is a diagnosis of elimination. You get left with it after the hardware things get removed, which, is an interesting process. And a lot about migraine is unknown, and I acknowledge that I'm sure that in 5-10 years we'll know a lot more about it. And I think at the beginning, when I was left with this kind of understanding that hardware is okay, software is faulty, you're kind of left with this huge question mark over how it's faulty, in what ways it's unreliable. And migraine is something that affects so much of the brain, and therefore one's experience in like this myriad different ways, that itself is changing and evolving. One thing that I learned was that migraine doesn't stay the same. It's evolving over time. It's dynamically shifting and becoming something else. So it's interesting because vertigo is at its very premise like a hallucination of motion that isn't there, or an experience of movement that is an illusion. It's not really moving. You're not really in this kind of swirl of movement. But when you're experiencing it, there's no real difference between that being an illusion and it being, a very direct experience.
Yeah, just to jump in on software as well really quickly, I think defining that metaphor was something that was really interesting for us, because I think a lot of the time you would jump in and create an effect or, a little experiment, and to be able to create these analogies or ways of expressing your experience of VM, you would then go, I think this is how my brain is working. Like, I think the way that I experienced this like stretch effect that you saw in the Jamais Vu, like little preview that we did, is the software is caching movement data and then spitting it back out on a delay. And that gave you this like really strong metaphor, and also like, I guess, like more physiological understanding of why your brain was doing it and how, like, you'd suspected, but then you had to, in order to recreate that sensation, you had to build a strange, different caching system for movement. And so that was a really interesting process to think about it in terms of software and the physicality of software.
And what's really fascinating, just quickly, is the porosity, this bidirectional relationship to the creation of work around it. Because when I created the delay effect, that kind of wobbling, stretching, elasticity, it felt so true to how the world feels a lot of the time. But so porous is my vestibular system that now I actually experience the world like that effect. So it's really kind of interesting, and something that I'm kind of taking into account now, how open that software is to different impressions that it can kind of store and use in its own way.
Fascinating. Mandy.
Hi. So yeah, thanks. That was a really beautiful presentation. And I loved this project when I tried it at IDFA. I really enjoyed it. It's beautifully realized and beautifully simple and meaningful. So I guess I'm kind of excited about these multi-sensory projects, partly because they ask something completely different of let's call them the participants. They ask us that we don't kind of, there's not the kind of mastery thing that you get in a kind of watching a video. I'm not finding out about the world through visual and audio. I'm being asked to explore and to surrender to the project. But it seems from your description that, of the process, that actually that was going on too in the process of development. A lot of kind of, a kind of surrender to a different kind of devising thing, right? You didn't start off with a written script as to what you're pursuing. So I guess in a way what I'm asking about is what you're learning about devising these projects. And I noticed that you coded this yourself or in part. So I wonder kind of what place that had in devising Turbulence.
Do you want to start with the construction of it? I mean, so I came home once after I'd been at a conference. I came home and Ben kind of said, "Look at this." And he'd just been playing a lot, like a lot of teaching yourself to use Touch Designer was just kind of not necessarily knowing what one could do in a way that one might if you were a developer by trade or things like that, and discovering these things along the way of what happens if I plug this into this, or dial this up on the spectrum, or anything like that, and finding what felt interesting and different. And so, and that was very much where Jamais Vu came from, was you found that kind of black and white aesthetic. We played with pass-through before in some previous work, and have always found it this really interesting derealizing kind of effect. So that was something that we were immediately really interested. We knew we were already kind of interested in exploring. We just hadn't thought about exploring it in this direction. But then in terms of then devising the work, it was, as you say, exceedingly experiential, because we knew the feeling was interesting, but there's immense possibilities for where it could be taken. And so a lot of our process was around what feels interesting in what order. So we would be, for a while we were trying to hang things out on the clothesline, reading books, looking in the mirror. We had a mirror in this hotel room, which is great, because that's always really interesting. Finding things that felt interesting to do or unusual to do in that world, while also kind of devising script and story around that. And then we did a lot of testing with a lot of people. So but we wanted to keep it really open. I think that was something that was very important to us in this, is, some people come in, they're very curious, they want to move around, touch everything, really explore what this new vision is. And some people come in and they just, I'm scared. And we want both of those sides of the spectrum to be able to explore on their own terms in their own time. So yeah.
And I think in terms of devising, one of the key kind of premises of the work, or principles of the work, really is that things are kind of like you're both becoming a little bit more familiar over time with the kind of like imposed new order of reality. But then over time, there's a difficulty curve that's also increasing with the wobble effect, but also being asked to do things that require like some motor control. But one of the really key parts of the work, and I think probably the part that I'm really the most proud of, is that it's a piece where, as Emma said, it's open, and more often than not, maybe 90% of the time, people do not complete the piece. They do not do the action that the voiceover is actually telling you to do.
They complete the piece, but they can't do the task.
They don't complete the task. But an important part of devising the work is that not completing the task doesn't feel like you've failed. It doesn't feel like you've not done the work correctly, but it's kind of the point. And I'm really proud that people kind of coming out of it understand that and don't feel like that there's been this kind of sense of personal failure, or this sense of like, oh, the experience was too difficult. And I think that normalizing difficulty and kind of also like rendering difficulty as direct as it does in this experience, I think was very important to me. And like, as I mentioned before, programming it on my own. I didn't really intend. I intended to prototype and then work collaboratively, but it kind of just happened that it did become entirely created by me in Touch Designer. And the profound insights that have come from that process, as we've talked about, has been really tremendous. And kind of a lot of the project was just following those insights and kind of just exploring very, very organically, and obviously drawing upon my own experience to find what feels right and what feels not right.
Thank you.
Rasheen.
Thank you so much. It was a deeply powerful piece, as Mandy said, in its own simplicity, like pieces, I would say, like just like this fields of exploration. Thinking about how making a difficult experience so poetic and so beautiful with its own subtlety and like the range of nuances. And I was thinking how, like any powerful piece, or any powerful, meaningful experience, how it transcends. It starts from that very deep personal experience, but it just transcends beyond, and it becomes so layered to connect with so many different aspects of our life. So I wanted to commend you on that. I don't really have right now a specific question because I'm processing. Like I feel like I'm just deeply processing all of these and I'm enjoying it. But I wanted to sort of make some comments about some and then kind of see what's coming up for you in terms of questions next. I thought the way that also this sort of caring, guided experience, that, you know, holding the audiences as you go through these experiences was so beautiful. And then while at the same time is also, while you're shifting between becoming oneself and becoming the other, and experiencing oneself and experiencing the other, is also self-guided too. So there was like all these paradox that you were talking about, that when you put them in juxtaposition, it really heightens the experiences. You mentioned the digital body and the physical body. And I felt like the way that you constantly use these juxtaposition with our physical bodies, how it really like heightened the feelings of physical body. And again, to kind of keep transcending it, like the transcendent of like feeling you and becoming you, and then just really connecting it to a multi like range of experiences. So I'm curious, like I'm really curious about experiences. I'm really curious about the co-creation aspect of the work, because it seems that it comes from like a very deep kind of discussions and conversations and these sort of really investigations, that it's also communal. So you have that process of in and out of self and becoming self and the other constantly in the process too. That is so beautiful. So I'm curious about all of those, and also it seems also the exploration of the technology is sort of similar. So I think this sort of fabric or the kind of Persian carpet or whatever the like ecosystem that you're creating with these. So I'm curious about, maybe this is not right now the right question, but I'm curious about the questions that is coming up next and the explorations that is coming next that is driven from these, or if you want to comment on any of these further.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, I think that idea of, it's interesting, actually, some of the points that you brought up really interrelate for me. We have a group of people that we collaborate with really regularly, Matt and Aaron, the two sound artists, and Jamie, who's a very good friend of ours and has been for some time. We love, sharing ideas and talking through our work very deeply. He's a very talented sound artist. And because of, as you said, there's this kind of in and out of the experience, and this opening up of Ben's expression, the way, like, I guess having that collaboration in place and that really open sharing in the creation of the work was really useful, because it meant that we had these people to puzzle through ideas, what things meant, what are the strands of this that are beautiful to pull out, rather than often, this can be a very terrifying experience. And so that was really valuable, and it reminds me of the conversations that we had around, particularly around, as you were saying, the guided and held nature of the experience. So we'd made an early version of it and had put Erin, one of our collaborators, through it, and her response was just that it felt so lonely and like and existentially quite terrifying for that reason, because you are there. I don't think there was much voiceover at the time. There was no music at the time because we were very early in the process, and it was just her and her disassociated body. And And off the back of the conversations around that emotional response to what essentially is the very similar materials, we were really careful in crafting together something that felt very held and very guided, so that you always felt safe within this environment, even though it is something that's quite confronting. That was just my thought on that, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for all of those wonderful reflections. And yeah, I mean, it stirs up a lot of different things on my end as well. And yeah, I mean, as Emma says, you know, very deeply collaborative and very important for me to have, you know, other artists, other people that I connect so deeply with that, you know, help kind of reflect and refract my experience through different experiences. And I think that that was very important, because I certainly didn't want people, you know, and in the very early prototyping, you know, some people would take the headset off and say, oh shit, I wouldn't like to be you, or that sounds horrible, or like, yeah, this kind of like almost like despairing response. And as Emma said, you know, like before we had all these kind of like the craft to make it feel, you know, supported and held, and you know, the vulnerability of the kind of narration and the voiceover and the intimacy of where it's placed, you know, helps kind of unlock your sense of kind of comfort and trust and kind of shared vulnerability. That, yeah, we kind of realized that like that, you know, in a lot of ways just isn't useful. So, you know, very important to have had this kind of really deep process. It's very much ongoing, you know, like we've been lucky to kind of collaborate with a lot of artists for a very long period of time. So it's a very deep conversation and a shared kind of understanding of what, you know, these kind of like multimodal works can do, and what they can reconnect you as an audience with, and why and how, which are very kind of important and kind of ongoing questions and kind of concerns that we have, particularly when we're using these kind of technologies that, you know, can be used for good and for reconnection, or can be used in very kind of different ways. So yeah.
Great. We only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly to the audience questions to make sure to get them, and then we'll go to you, Joanna. This is a question from Juanita Pineda Oviedo. I've met several new media artists that have trouble connecting with the title artist, so a little different type of question. They feel alienated from the Academy and its formal definition of art. How is your relationship with the Art Academy? Do you feel included, or do you place yourself in some other area or in the margins?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't really actually know. I don't know if I have a definite answer. You know, I'm in the final stages of completing a PhD, so I'm kind of in the kind of like academic world, but I don't know, I feel more and more that my work is in reaching audiences and people outside of those kind of confines. To be honest, I had a lot of difficulty. I think we both had a lot of difficulty with the term artist. Particularly, we came from like filmmaking disciplines where you have this kind of hierarchical titles and whatnot that we were using, but didn't feel true to our collaborative style. But certainly as a director, you're quite like removed. I mean, you're guiding the creative process entirely, but you're also removed from the making of the work. And I think that in a lot of ways, Jamais Vu in this kind of like ongoing work now, where it's kind of like us with the materials, you know, plugging things in and kind of creating things and delivering them, has helped me reconcile a lot of my own kind of like questions around yeah, like what I kind of define myself as. I don't know what.
But I still think because we do come from filmmaking background, I still think we're learning about what is different between art world and kind of film and documentary world, which is where we're coming from. So that's an ongoing process. So I do feel like I'm finding my feet in what that means and where and how that how that works.
And ultimately how we can create our own practice that's sustainable and healthy and, you know, as collaborative as possible.
Great. One other question from Liza Factor. Hi, Ben and Emma. Nice to see your new brilliant work. Thank you for the beautiful and emotional presentation. Have you thought about working with disabled community patients with traumatic brain injury or brain conditions in the framework of your current research? And since VR is inaccessible to them, how would you engage with them?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. We have considered, you know, I think this early phase of works are, you know, very much us coming into kind of contact with this idea of how to express disability, how to accept it. For me, you know, on a personal level, kind of stepping into this part of myself and kind of really truly accepting it. And I think because of that, these first works have very much been on a very deeply personal, intimate level of me trying to express something outwardly, you know, on a very basic level, as I mentioned, to Emma, to my family and friends, and then obviously to, you know, those who go through the experience. So that's certainly something, you know, engaging with kind of community, VM community in particular, first and foremost, and kind of like being able to kind of share the, you know, the plethora of experiences that exist on that particular continuum. Vestibular migraine is so wide and varying. And then obviously the capacity to build that out to other communities is something that's really important to us. And something that we're really looking forward to doing kind of in the future.
Yeah, I guess the other side of that is that I think this is where that interest to step away from VR in the first place came from, and remains, as well as like there are these other ways to create work that are expressing through different media in different ways that can be accessible in different ways for different people. So that's certainly something that that we've been thinking through in particular, like when working with, like, we're not going to make a VR piece for and about VM community because that's just inherently difficult. But like vestibular access is a really interesting question because the things that trigger vestibular migraine are the world and things that are impossible to extract from that. It's impossible to completely remove movement from your experience, and so exploring ways to engage with it is a super interesting question that we've been spending a fair amount of time on lately.
Fascinating. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for this brilliant and fascinating talk, and to all the respondents and the attendees. There is one last question, which is a good way to end, and that is, where can they see your work? Do you have a website? If you want to answer that before we go.
Thank you. It's always difficult, isn't it, with highly experiential work? It really needs to be experienced in situ.
Some of it.
Some of it. Jamais Vu is showing in Copenhagen at the moment. We've got a few other festivals kind of hopefully lined up, and hopefully a lot more kind of presentations. And we really want, you know, this work as well as all of our work to be as accessible as possible, to reach as many people as possible. Often that is quite difficult. Yeah, so Ben's website is benjosephandrews.com, and we've been kind of listing and detailing projects on there. But there are a few more that hopefully in the next couple of months we'll be able to pop on there as well once they've finished doing some showings that we have lined up. Around Europe and Europe, UK, and Australia. So, yeah. Terrific. Well, thank you again. Thank you to everyone, to the attendees as well. We'll be back in 2 weeks, April 2nd, to talk about the impact of XR on climate change. It's a research report by Landia Egel and Amari Laberth. And so until then, have a wonderful week, 2 weeks, and thank you again. Bye-bye.